many pleasures as chair of the department, but one of the things that I like the best is that I get to meet really interesting people. And one of the things that I like about Detroit is the fact that I think some of the most interesting people in the world live in the Detroit metropolitan area. And those things have sort of coincided today. John Hardy was an activist in the civil rights movement and has an absolutely wonderful understanding of what was going on because, as you may well know from the title of his talk, he was a foot soldier in the civil rights movement. He was someone who was extraordinarily well experienced in almost every aspect of the movement. And so we've invited him here today because we think that he has a lot of wonderful stuff to share with us about his experiences. And so without further ado, John Hardy, please come on up and tell us stuff.
Before I start, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, strength of my Redeemer, my Lord. Before I really get started, I want to say that a gentleman just walked in that I have not seen in years. And he brought a picture of me in a play. I'm a professional actor. The play was Glenn Ross. And I played the bad guy. But this morning I will be the good guy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, DeWitt, for that wonderful introduction. I'm sorry, Karen, excuse me. I had written it down. I did that because as a professional, you try not to make mistakes. So I said, well, the best way to demonstrate a mistake is to make one. So here I am. Thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, as my title implies, these are my reflections and memories of a civil rights foot soldier. I want to say thanks to DeWitt for inviting me to participate in the Oakland University's African American Celebration Month, to the Oakland University History Department, the Center for Multicultural Initiatives, faculty and students. I'm honored for being afforded this opportunity to share my reflections. I really appreciate this opportunity because it gives me a chance to share with people the things that I experienced and the things that appear to be resurfacing again, confronting us now. Our rights are being challenged. From slavery to freedom, education has always played a pivotal role in the advancement of African Americans in every aspect of their struggle for equal rights. Now, whether that has been, it has been the key that unlocks the doors of empowerment and opportunity, whether demanding and gaining access to the front seat of the bus, being served at a lunch counter, buying property, or gaining the right to vote, then running for public office and serving as a people's representative. The sit-in movement, economic boycotts, freedom rides, and voter registration drives, with the use of nonviolence as the preferred discipline tactic, brought us victories, which some people today would like to take away. Have you heard that the Tea Party and some members of the Republican Party want to reinstate such things as literacy tests, ID cards as a voter registration requirement? Michigan already requires voter registration IDs, and for the record, in the AARP news letter that comes, it lists the states that are requiring these. This will not only work a hardship for people who don't drive cars, but older people who, for example, after they stop driving, they really don't think about going down to get an ID card. There are a lot of people in this country, believe it or not, in this day and age who were born at home, so they don't have a birth certificate, which you need to get a voter registration card. Just a little bit of information there. In my reflections this morning, I'd like to share with you the small part I played in this drama of change called the civil rights movement. Frederick Douglass reminds us, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. The next slide we cater to white trade only. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, the Athens of the segregated South. The more familiar name is Music City, USA, which would come much later. However, everything was separate, but not equal. Throughout the South, many states, counties, and municipalities, including Nashville, had a bewildering array of inconsistent segregation laws mandating separation of the races. Tens and thousands of men, women, boys, and girls, most of them black and some white, were arrested during the freedom movement for violating these demanding and dehumanizing laws. Separate water fountains, separate movie entrances. You name it, they did it. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Those of us who had parents who cared about us, teachers who nurtured us, made sure that we understood that we had a right to the tree of life. After federal courts began declaring school and bus segregation laws unconstitutional, most Southern prosecutors were careful to charge blacks who defied segregation with general crimes, such as disturbing the peace or disorderly conduct, rather than the violation of race-specific segregation laws. And in this way, they prevented the courts from overturning the segregation ordinances on appeal that allowed store owners to continue claiming that they had to deny service to blacks because it's the law. Now, this cynical ploy was used to maintain segregation. Nashville, Tennessee, even under the repressive laws of segregation, was a great place to be born. It was great because our parents, teachers, and community elders nurtured in us and encouraged us to challenge tradition and to be all that we could be, and that without joining the Army. This supportive environment would be a key ingredient in the life and vitality of the Nashville student movement. I personally felt inspired to explore many of my revolutionary ideas for challenging the system regarding the rights of man and the need to fight for equality and civil rights. It was in Nashville that I learned about Mohandas Gandhi. I cannot teach you violence as I do not myself believe in it. I can only teach you not to bow your heads before anyone. Don't bow your head, even at the cost of your life. Theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who suffered at the hands of the Germans, wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship, in which he states, action springs not from thought, but from a readiness for responsibility. We were nurtured and we were prepared. My parents, Boise Jackson and Mamie Benson Hardy, Alabama natives by way of Memphis, Tennessee, were hardworking, community-minded, God-fearing Southern parents. They instilled in me and my brothers and sisters the need for an education as a way to enrich the mind in order to navigate the perils of segregation and Jim Crow. They encouraged us to be involved in our church, our school, community, as a way to make a spiritual and political difference. By the time I entered Tennessee State University in the fall of 1959, we were starting to hear rumors on campus about the possibility of direct action. Sit-ins. James Lawson had come to Nashville from Oberlin College in Ohio and quietly began to recruit students for nonviolent training workshops for a direct assault on the segregationist laws of our city, our county, and our state. James Lawson had traveled to India, where he studied the principles of nonviolent resistance taught by Gandhi and his followers. He returned to the United States in 1955, entering the Graduate School of Theology at Oberlin College in Ohio. While at Oberlin, one of his professors introduced him to Dr. Martin Luther King, who had also embraced Gandhi's principles of nonviolent resistance. King urged Lawson, go south. We have no one like you down there. Praise God that Jim Lawson did come to Nashville. He enrolled in Vanderbilt University, and he was the director of CORE and began conducting nonviolent workshops. Reverend Lawson trained many of the future leaders of the 60s civil rights movement, among them Diane Nash, James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, Marion Barry, former mayor of Washington, and John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis. In 1959 and 60, these and other Lawson-trained activists launched the Nashville sit-ins to challenge segregation in downtown stores. Along with activists from Atlanta, Georgia, and elsewhere in the South, they formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in April of 1960. On February 1st, 1960, 4 black men from North Carolina A&T, Ezell Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, they sat down at the Walgreens counter, whites only lunch counter, and asked to be served coffee and donuts. They were refused. Though they were prepared to be arrested, nobody arrested them. They stayed until the store closes. The next day they returned. This time they're joined by Billy Smith, Clarence Henderson, and others. They sit from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. But again, they're not served. And while they wait, they study and prepare their schoolwork. The local newspaper and TV station covers this second sit-in. At first they called it a sit-down, but soon everyone is using the term sit-in. When the lunch counters sit-ins started in Nashville, I was in the third quarter of my freshman year at Tennessee Agricultural and Industrial State University, better known today as just Tennessee State. I was majoring in speech and drama. Now, in February 1960, after confirming that nonviolent workshops were being held and we were sitting in, I decided I would go and join one of the workshops. The movement was underway. On Saturday, February 13th, less than 2 weeks after the Greensboro sit-in, more than 100 students commenced the Nashville student movement, the largest, best organized, most disciplined, and most persistent of the student sit-in groups in the South. They occupied Kresge's, McClellan's, Woolworth's, lunch counters. The word went out that if the movement was to be successful, many more demonstrators would be required. Since I had finished my nonviolent training, my hand went up. I had finished my workshop, and my trainer was Curtis Murphy, sitting on the right-hand side of me at the Walgreens drugstore in Nashville, Tennessee. Please note the sign, fountain closed in the interest of public safety. Not ours. On February 20th, at the risk of hurting my parents' chances of earning a living, I joined this hundreds of students and the sit-ins. White racists heckle and attack the students who meet and defeat violence with the tactics of nonviolent resistance. Nonviolence is a weapon. Please remember that. We were continually reminded of Dr. King saying that if we succumb to the temptations to use violence in our struggle for freedom, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and our chief legacy to them will be a never-ending reign of chaos. We took these words as our mantra and went into battle for equal rights. This slide shows us after we were arrested. We were crowded into a jail cell that was only designed to hold 4 people, and there were about 20 of us in this cell. That's me with my hand on my chin and the gray striped sweater on the bottom bunk. The gentleman lying next to me on his chin, on his elbows, is Cordell Reagan. You may hear that name if you study any of the civil rights movement or you're familiar with the now famous Freedom Singers. He was the founder. What I feared at the start of the sit-ins, my participation would cause economic reprisals against my parents. It had come to pass. The next morning, my picture appears in the Nashville Tennessean and later the Banner, the local paper, and the entire world could see that Mamie Hardy's son was raising Cain. My mother was working at the Hermitage Hotel as a maid, think the help, in the housekeeping department, and had developed quite a reputation for being a great employee. However, the day following our arrest and my picture being in the paper, it didn't sit well with some people. The supervisor, holding a copy of the Tennessean, asked her if she knew the young man in the picture sitting at the Walgreens lunch counter. My mother proudly said, "Yes, I do. That's my son, John." Without missing a beat, my mother defended the students' nonviolent protest, saying, "It's about time." My mother was a Christian, so she wouldn't cuss. In spite of this seeming setback, pause in the conversation, there was kind of this, you know how two people can glare at each other with no words, but you know what they're thinking? The supervisor was quite furious. And after a few choice words, told you my mama don't cuss, the lady did. She told my mother that she could leave the hotel and didn't need to come back to work, and she'd probably never get another job in that town. I know some of you will hear that over your lifetime. In spite of this setback, my mother got a much better job at David Lipscomb University, a Church of Christ school, the next week. She later would be hired by Fisk University to work in Crossway Residence Hall, where she worked for many years before her death in June 25th, 1970. Nashville's black community stood boldly behind us. Preachers, teachers, you name it. 2 days after the first sit-in, the leadership in Nashville's black religious community voted to support us. The Nashville Christian Leadership Council organizes a crippling boycott of downtown merchants. Racist violence against the sit-ins escalate with harassments and beating. The violent hecklers are not arrested. Instead, the nonviolent protesters are hauled off to jail. The city tries to intimidate the students and break the boycott with mass arrests and fill the jails to overflowing. Jailing the students fails to break the movement. The united students and community hang tough. When 81 of the students are convicted of disorderly conduct, they refuse to pay the fine, choosing instead to serve their time in jail. And here at the hearing, on the right side, by the way, of the big picture is Z. Alexander Luby, the man in the white hair. Talk about him in a moment. That's Diane Nash on the left, and Reverend Kelly Miller Smith of the Nashville Christian Leadership Conference. Diane and some of the protesters standing before the judge, Diane explains why we would not stop what we were doing. We feel that if we pay these fines, we would be contributing to and supporting the injustice and immoral practice that have been performed in the arrest and conviction of the defendants. Next day, Reverend Lawson is expelled from Vanderbilt University. In later years, he's invited back to speak as one of their great honored guest lecturers. Other students are threatened with reprisals. The sit-ins continue. Mayor Ben West offers us a compromise. We can divide the lunch counter down the middle, separate black, separate white sections. NCLC and the students reject this proposal. Why? Separate is not equal. Following this, on April 19th, the home of the attorney that was in the previous picture, Z. Alexander Luby, who was defending us, his home was bombed. In other words, someone came into our community and tossed a bomb into this man's house. Following this horrendous act of violence, a community mass meeting is announced by the NCLC and SNCC for April 21st, 1960, to be held at the Fisk University Chapel. There was standing room only inside the chapel, and folk were lined up outside. In those days, we didn't have those big Tron TVs that you could put outside, so they had to hear it over the speakers. At the mass meeting, John Lewis and I sang in an early version of the now famous Freedom Singers. That's me in the tan suit.
And this is Congressman John Lewis here. The gentleman in the middle is
Guy Caravan. Guy was a folk singer who worked with Highlander Folk School, now known as Highlander Research and Education Center. He is credited with teaching us our famous anthem, "We Shall Overcome." Thousands of demonstrators, students and adults, including many whites, marched through Nashville to the steps of City Hall. Diane Nash presses Mayor Ben West to admit that segregation is morally wrong, that lunch counters should be desegregated. The mayor, standing in the middle there, on the left-hand side between C.T. Vivian and I can't remember the other gentleman's name at the time, now, acknowledges it, and admits that segregation is morally wrong and that something should be done. Nashville becomes the first southern city to start desegregating its public facilities through demonstrations. The first city to desegregate its lunch counter facilities, but demonstrations still continued until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1954, which makes overt legally sanctioned segregation illegal. One of the, what did I say? Sorry. I meant 64. Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally makes overt legally sanctioned segregation illegal. The key to the success of the Nashville movement is based upon effective strategies and planning. The movement leaders in Nashville appear to have had a deeper commitment to the long-range goals of the civil rights struggle. On January 31st, 1961, we received a letter from Reverend Kelly Miller Smith, president of the NCLC, that our attorneys had successfully won us a victory where that all the charges brought against us during the sit-ins had been dismissed. However, we were now starting to face new challenges. Desegregation of public facilities in Nashville also marks a turning point for SNCC, as well as myself. Diane Nash, James Bevel, Marion Barry, John Lewis, C.T. Vivian are totally committed to a long-term effort that was required of the civil rights movement. This is also a testing time for me, because right now I'm at a point of understanding that the sit-ins are over and I have this burning energy inside of me to make even bigger changes. So, but I went back to school, changed my major from speech and drama to political science. I thought this major would give me a stronger base for future movement work. Didn't prove to be the case. I completed 2/4 of my sophomore year and was so frustrated by the lack of drama that I found in the direct action movement. I went home, told my parents that I was dropping out of school and I was going to join the movement. Please understand, my mother was not excited to see me on that lunch counter stool. She knew what was going on now, so she wasn't as excited. But she also remembered that it was she and my father who encouraged us to stand up for what was right. So they hesitantly agreed, and I dropped out of school. And I worked as a full-time volunteer, unpaid, you know volunteer, right? In the Nashville SNCC office. My early assignments really weren't glamorous at all. Basically, I'm answering the phones, printing flyers, handouts, running errands, and cleaning the office. In time, however, I would become a fundraiser and a volunteer recruiter. It's during this time that I'm exposed to the larger community of social activists and organizations such as the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization that includes people from various faiths who are committed to social justice, peace, and humanitarian service. I also attend conferences at the Highlander Folk School. Highlander is known for working with people fighting for justice, equality, and sustainability, supporting their efforts to take collective action to shape their destiny. By the spring of 1961, I'm given the opportunity to become a SNCC field representative. My assignments include fundraising, volunteer recruitment, participation in the continuing sit-ins and boycotts in Albany, Georgia, Columbia, Rock Hill, Orangeburg, and Charleston, South Carolina, Montgomery, Alabama, Jackson, Tougaloo, Hattiesburg, Greenville, and Greenwood, Mississippi. Other work, which would later become my focus and passion, included researching voter registration statistics and participating in the SNCC voter registration projects in these cities. In December of 1960, the Supreme Court rules in Boynton case, Boynton versus Virginia, that segregation in interstate commerce and travel is illegal. And as a matter of federal law, integrated travel on interstate buses and trains is a legal right. Separate white and colored toilets and dining rooms for interstate travelers are no longer allowed. Travelers have the right to use whatever facilities they choose and sit wherever they wish. Now, please remember one thing, as you have all learned in your lifetimes by now, I'm sure. You can create a law, you can enact a law, pass the law, and you got to enforce the law, though. But if you're talking about doing it in the South, that wasn't going to happen right away. On May 4th, Corps Director James Farmer led 13 Freedom Riders, 7 black and 6 white, out of Washington on the Greyhound Trailways buses. They planned to ride through Virginia, Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and their final destination is New Orleans, Louisiana. Now, most of the riders are from Corps. Many are in their 40s and 50s, and 2 are young students from SNCC, John Lewis being one of them. They got through Virginia, North Carolina, but John Lewis, Al Bigelow, and Genevieve Hughes are beaten in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Defying the Boynton ruling, local police arrest some of the riders in Charlotte, North Carolina. The victim becomes the villain. This next slide, I'm sorry, let me step back a minute. That's James Farmer in the middle pointing toward the paper. The gentleman on the right-hand side here is Henry Thomas, who was later beaten viciously with a baseball bat in Anniston. Hank today is a very successful businessman who owns multiple McDonald's and hotels, and he's also was one of the organizers of the 50th anniversary celebration of the Freedom Rides. You may have seen him on Oprah, but later in Mississippi, they had a great celebration, which he was kind of underwrote a lot. He underwrote it. Let me get my words right here. He spent a lot of his own money making sure that people did not forget the trials and tribulations that we experienced during the movement. Now, the next slide are some of the routes which you can actually pull up on the web so you can see the routes that they went, and the legend describes the Little Freedom Ride on April 22nd all the way down to the Route 40 campaign in November and December. And you can pull that up and take a look at it. White political leaders in Georgia chose not to defy the Supreme Court by arresting riders, nor do they incite racist hysteria or mob violence. The riders crossed Georgia, Augustus, Athens, and Atlanta without incident. But in Alabama and in Mississippi, segregationist politicians seized on the Freedom Rides as a political opportunity, railing against integration, race mixers, communist plots, the Supreme Court, and the federal government. Does that sound familiar to anybody in here? In this slide, with the cooperation of the cops on Sunday, Mother's Day, May 14, 1961, a racist mob of more than 100 Klansmen ambushed the riders in Anniston, Alabama, attacking the Greyhound bus, smashing the windows and slashing the tires. The bus tries to flee, but the attackers give chase, halting it on the outskirts of town, then setting it on fire. The mob holds the doors shut to burn the riders inside. The Alabama Highway Patrol has an undercover cop on board. He pulls his gun to force the Klansmen back. The passengers stumble off the bus, barely escaping with their lives, just before the gas tank explodes. SNCC student Hank Thomas, whom I mentioned earlier, is beaten with a baseball bat to the head while the others are assaulted. When the violence subsides, a 12-year-old white girl whose father owns a store nearby, comes out. In spite of the taunts and the jeers and the insults, she brought water to the bleeding riders who are still choking from the smoke. For daring to help the injured riders, she and her family are later ostracized and forced to leave the county. Photos and news reports of the burning bus in Anniston and the mob violence in Birmingham flash around the nation and around the world, to the great embarrassment of the Kennedys, who were more concerned about the relationship with Russia and Khrushchev than they were about, I think he was more concerned about the fact that they were going to put nuclear missiles down in Cuba. But he blames extremists on both sides, and they called for a cooling off period. Extremists. Freedom movement activists are both dumbfounded and outraged. Yes, clearly smashing people's skulls with baseball bats and trying to burn them alive in a hijacked bus are the acts of extremists. But the nonviolent freedom riders are peaceful, and their actions are entirely legal under federal law. By what measure of justice and common sense can they be labeled extremists? The next day, the Greyhound and Trailways drivers refused to drive the riders forward. Unable to proceed to Montgomery, the Corps riders decided to fly to New Orleans, to attend a previously scheduled rally. But they are the guests and the main speakers, but they really can't get out of town. They have no way to get out. Now, bomb threats prevent the plane from taking off. They are harassed by other Klan members as they wait hour after hour after hour at the airport. Finally, pressure from Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the airline managers get a flight off the ground in the dead of night, and the Corps riders reach New Orleans. If you watch the movie The Freedom Riders, John Siegenthaler, whom I also met along with John Doerr, was the person who went down to New Orleans to meet the riders to get them to New Orleans. They think the rides are over, but they don't know that some young people have decided that this is a cause worth fighting. Though they know they're putting their young lives in deadly peril, the activists from SNCC-affiliated Nashville Student Movement won't allow the KKK to defeat the ride. Student leader Diane Nash tells the late Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, the students have decided that we can't let violence overcome. We're coming to Birmingham to continue the freedom rides. The elders, teachers, community leaders, and pastors are certain they will be killed and try to dissuade them. The students are not deterred. They had all signed their last will and testament. They were prepared to die. Since our funding was not always readily available, we needed to raise monies to continue our efforts. It is during this time that I have the opportunity to go on many fundraising trips with some of our recuperating warriors. Believe it or not, that's me in the white shorts. Bermuda shorts, we called them, with long socks and shined shoes. That's Jim Swerg in the middle, and if you see the Freedom Rider film, you will see Jim lying on his hospital gurney, saying that he was willing to die for the cause. On his left is Bill Harbor, who also was brutally assaulted and served time in jail in the Freedom Rides. We're at the American Friends Service Committee camp in Wisconsin. The Freedom Riders are arrested in Jackson for violating local segregation laws. Many are sentenced to Parchman State Prison. At this point, you see that the troops have been sent out. These are the National Guardsmen, by the way, to protect the riders. Though the president and his brother, the attorney general, think it's over, they and the nation are in for a rude awakening. Instead of the violence stopping the rides, more freedom riders followed, coming down from the north, rolling in from the west. All are imprisoned. More than 300 are jailed in Jackson, Mississippi alone. Similar arrests occur in other southern towns. The rides only end when the public outcry forces the Kennedy administration to enforce the laws and rulings prohibiting segregation in interstate commerce. As important as the freedom rides were for the future of interstate travel, I didn't really feel I was making a big enough sacrifice. Whenever a new bus was scheduled and I was ready to go, I was given another assignment, which I gladly accepted. Although my activities as a field representative for SNCC involved travel on both Greyhound and Trailways buses, I was never arrested. Now, it's kind of ironic in a way. I am asking to go into the belly of the beast, to be arrested. In July 1961, while participating in protest demonstrations in South Carolina, I had a discussion with some of our leadership. And I told them that I didn't feel like I was being fulfilled or that I was not adding enough to the movement in the fight for equal rights. Yes, I'd been arrested, jailed many places that I visited. However, up until that time, I had escaped the violence that so many of my compatriots had faced. Little did I know at the time what I would face in Mississippi, in the heart of the most segregated and brutal state in the Deep South. A dear friend of mine reminded me recently that I was suffering from survivor guilt. Charles Jones asked if I would be willing to join Robert Bob Moses to head SNCC's voter registration Mississippi project. The project officially kicked off August 7th of 1961 in Macomb, Mississippi, and it was designed to serve 3 counties, Walthall, Pike, and Amet. The intended purpose was to train local black citizens to interpret the 1890 Mississippi State Constitution as amended and practice the registration test administered by local unsympathetic registrars. You'll understand that statement later. We are to qualify as many black voters as possible. I didn't think twice about it. I said, yes, I'll go, and I was on my way. I know you can read, but I want to say these words. Voting, the basic right of citizenship. The most basic right of a citizen in a democracy is the right to vote. Without this right, people can be easily ignored and even abused by their government. This, in fact, is what happened to African American citizens living in the South following Civil War Reconstruction. Despite the 14th, 15th Amendment guaranteeing the civil rights of black Americans, their right to vote was systematically taken away by white supremacist state governments. At the end of July 61, I traveled to Macomb, Mississippi to join Bob Moses, Reginald Robinson, and Marion Barry for training and opening of SNCC voter registration training schools. This is truly now my journey into the belly of the beast. Today now, most of you have experienced the realities of registering to vote by simply filling out a card, get your card in the mail, you go get a driver's license, you can do all of that at the Secretary of State's office. But back in those days, it wasn't like that at all. Prior to the passage of the Federal Voting Rights Act in 1965, Southern and some Western states maintained an elaborate voter registration procedures whose primary purpose was to deny the vote to those who were not white. In the South, this process was often referred to as a literacy test. Now, most of you by now have in your hands a copy of the Mississippi application. We'll talk about it in a moment. But it's kind of involved. Alabama's was even more specific. In some regions of this country, Latinos and Native Americans were also denied the right to vote. Now, this next slide is showing 2 African Americans attempting to register to vote. But please note, there is a sign above them, which reads, applications for registration must be completely filled out without any assistance or suggestions of any person or memorandum. After 10 days, applicants' names and addresses are published for 2 consecutive weeks in the newspaper. They cannot be ruled on for 14 days after the second publication. Therefore, it can take us as long as 33 days before we can give you an answer as to your application being accepted or rejected. Your indulgence is appreciated. The registrar. The registration procedures and the registrars who enforced them were just one part of this interlocking system of racial discrimination and oppression. The various state, county, and local police forces, all white of course, routinely intimidated and harassed blacks who tried to register. They arrested would-be voters on false charges and beat others for imagined transgressions. And often, this kind of retribution was directed not only at the man or the woman who dared to try to register, but against their family members as well, and even their children. I'm sure some of you have seen some of these pictures. As if economic pressure proved insufficient, the Ku Klux Klan was ready with violence and mayhem, cross burnings, night riders, beatings, rapes, church bombings, and arson of businesses and homes, murder and mob lynching, drive-by shootings, and sniper assassinations were all used as forms of intimidation. Today, these people would be called terrorists, but back then, the white establishment saw them as defenders of Southern heritage and the Southern way of life. Sound familiar? You just let that ride there for a minute. While in theory, there were standard statewide registration procedures, but in real life, the individual registrars and clerks could do whatever they wanted to. They didn't have to see you, they could close the office, they could ignore you. In early 1960, Mississippi was the poorest state in the nation. 86% of all non-white families lived below the national poverty line. In addition, the state had a terrible record of black voting rights violations. In the 1950s, Mississippi was 45% black, but only 5% of voting age blacks were registered to vote. Some counties did not have a single registered black voter. But whites insisted that blacks did not want to vote. But this was not the case. Many blacks wanted to vote, but they worried, and rightfully so, that they might lose their job or their life. And according to Bob Moses, quote unquote, this is Mississippi, the middle of the iceberg. After I got settled in Macomb and getting a lay of the land, I attended orientation sessions with Bob and the rest of our team. Bob, Marion, Reggie, the late Jimmy Travis, MacArthur Cotton, Ruby McGee, college students, and a young high school student named Brenda Travis. Brenda Travis was among the Bugland High School students who walked out to support our cause and our effort. They all got expelled, but Brenda got the worst of it. Her family was asked to leave the state, where she has never returned except for a visit. After that week, I was given my assignment to set up training classes in Tylertown, Walthall County, Mississippi. And if you look it up and you look at the history of Mississippi, Tylertown was not the place to be. Like I said earlier, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Although we were in the middle of the iceberg, the black citizens of Mississippi opened their homes, their hearts. They treated us like family. They housed us. They fed us. They provided us with transportation. They worshiped with us, entertained us, and yes, and most importantly, they permitted us to put them in harm's way. But as I was often reminded by one of my first and favorite students, Mrs. Edith Peters, I'm tired of waiting for my freedom. I've waited long enough. For the record, there were at the time some 2,490 Negroes of voting age in Walthall County, Mississippi, none of whom were registered to vote. There were some 4,500 white persons of voting age in Walthall County. A substantial number were registered to vote. Shortly after moving to Tylertown, I got busy setting up the voter registration training classes at Mount Moriah Baptist Church. And I'm sure when you've read through some of your history or watched television, you've seen that folk who are terrorists don't have any respect for churches or religion. In these classes, we would issue the facsimiles, which you have in your hand, necessary for registration, and a copy of the Constitution of the state of Mississippi. I believe I have a section on the 3rd page there. The application is on the first 2 pages, and sections of the Constitution is on the last page, I believe, yes. Now imagine, if you will, someone who's actually been smart enough to buy a farm, 70 and 80 acres respectively. That would be Ms. Peters and Mr. Wilson, who later I take to registrar's office, making a living on their property. But folk want to deny them the opportunity to participate in the franchise, and not only that, have these really looped ideas on what their capabilities are. Please note, there's some red lettering at the bottom of my slide here that reads, and I'm going to stop for 1 second. In 1954, in response to the increasing literacy among blacks, the test, which originally asked applicants to read or interpret, either or, right? That section of the state constitution was changed to applicants to read and interpret. It means if you could read and come in and read it, you could probably get away with it, get your voter registration card. When they changed the and, all of a sudden now you've got to write out your interpretation of a section of the state constitution of 1890. Just as an aside here, I'm going to mention a couple of things. First of all, when you look at the application and you look at some of the questions, they may seem innocent enough. But when you stop and think about how those questions can be used, for example, Alabama gotten even more specific than Mississippi. But the same tactic could be used. For example, if you answer under the question race, they would know who you were. Because, for example, back in the day, if one of your grandparents was black, you were considered a Negro, and the registrar could make that interpretation. For example, if you say, answer under resident, where do you live? In many counties, the White Citizens Council informed white landlords that their African-American tenants tried to register. I'm going to skip on down, go back to something I had said earlier. If you remember early on, I read the notice on the board that was in the registrar's office about how long it would take them to finally decide whether or not you qualified to register to vote. Well, they could use that against you. During that time, they could find folk where you worked. You say where you were employed. They would make sure that your employer knew you were an uppity nigger and you were trying to register to vote, which is only reserved for white folks. Are you a college student? If so, where? Southern colleges received financial aid from the state, got the most money, Jackson State, Tennessee State, where Freedom Riders were expelled, but later on, in 2008, they received honorary doctorate degrees as a way of apology. At any rate, have you ever been married? If so, give the name, residence, and place of birth of your husband, wife. Now, of course, if you answered those questions, they now know even more about you. So it wasn't just about where you lived or what you did. If they wanted to find out about you or intimidate you, just answering these simple questions. Have you had other employers in the past 5 years? If you were working for somebody now, they were going to know that you tried to register to vote. And if you worked for anybody else before that, you probably would never work again. Have you ever been dishonorably discharged from the military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? It goes on. Now, the first attempt of participants in the school to register took place on August 30th. And I accompanied 5 black citizens to the registrar's office. Now, 2 were allowed to come in and register, and fill out the registration form. Now, this was the first attempt made to register Negroes, the first not only since the school had been created, but also first since the Justice Department had filed a suit earlier in the spring. 5 people went into Tylertown. 2 of them were allowed to take the test. 1 was a teacher, the other a senior political science major at Jackson State University, the black state school. Both failed. We're talking about educated people failing a test of a registrar who probably couldn't read beyond a 3rd grade level. They failed unsatisfactory to the registrar. Let me move on here. Excuse me 1 second. Outside the registrar's office, I encountered the sheriff of Walthall County, Ed Kraft. You know, this is an old story about black folk in the South with a problem with police, but that seems to be a universal theme. Ed Kraft was in the company of the editor of the Tylertown Times, Paul Pittman. The sheriff asked me a number of questions about the school, whether I had a driver's license. I didn't have a clue whether or not I answered his question satisfactorily or not. Whatever the case, he took his leave and left. After the sheriff left, the editor of the Times interviewed me more extensively for an article which appeared on the front page of the Tylertown Times the next day. During the course of the interview, I allegedly, I love that word, I allegedly made a statement which was interpreted as an endorsement of atheism. This was to mark me if I had not already been marked. On September 4th, Mrs. Simmons Peters, 63-year-old owner of an 80-acre farm, I mentioned them earlier, and Mr. Lucius Wilson, age 62, owner of a 70-acre farm in Walthall. They started attendance. They were exceptional and enthusiastic about the possibility of finally being able to register to vote. By the end of the training class, September 6th, Mrs. Peters and Mr. Wilson thought they were ready to go and pass the test. Registrar John Q. Woods, one of my favorite characters, U.S. versus Woods. We arrived in Tylertown Courthouse in Mrs. Peters' pickup truck at about 9:30 in the morning. MacArthur Cotton was with me. We went into the registrar John Q. Woods' office. He was in his inner office. Mrs. Peters and Mr. Wilson went in, and I waited outside the door. While they're in there, he turns and asks them what they wanted. He said, "We want to register." Woods replied, "I ain't registering nobody today. Not until y'all get me out of this court thing. Y'all got me in court, and I refuse to register anyone until this court thing is cleared up. You hear me? So get on out." Now, from outside of the door, I could hear the conversation, and I started to go in, but before I could make the decision, I heard my name. "John." He was talking to me, so I started toward the door. Woods came out to the door and said, "I want to see you, boy." Now, as I entered, he brushed past me, went into the main room, and from the drawer of a desk took out a revolver. Holding the gun down by his right side, he pointed to the door. "Now, you go and get out of this business. You see that door, boy? I want you out of it right now." "Yes." Now, I'm thinking in my mind, this man has a gun. Bob has already been beaten a couple of weeks before. People have already been killed. I see the gun. He's serious. I decide it's time to move. So I start out the door. Just as I start to turn, he says, get yo out of this room, you SOB." And as I turned, he struck me with the pistol to this side of my head. Mrs. Peters, Mr. Wilson rushed out, held me up, then helped me to the exit of the building. We went first to the newspaper office, where I told the editor what had happened. Pittman instructed me to get medical attention right away since my head was now bleeding profusely. Staggering into the street, I encountered Sheriff Ed Kraft again, who all but laughed at my request that the registrar be assaulted. Instead, the sheriff hauled me off to the Tylertown jail, charging me with resisting arrest and inciting a riot. After several hours of interrogation by local prosecuting attorneys, I was told that I was being transferred to the Magnolia jail for my own protection, allegedly because the feelings about the incident was evidently running high in the community. By 9 o'clock that evening, I found myself in the same cell block that had housed Bob Moses 3 weeks earlier, following his beating at the hands of one of the local sheriff's relatives. Now, I thought things were bad at Tylertown, but let me tell you about Magnolia, briefly. It appears that I was the only prisoner in the jail that night. Now, it's 10 o'clock at night, and with no moon, it is pitch dark. A couple of hours later, the deputy says, "Hey, boy, I'm going home for dinner, but I wouldn't worry about a thing. I'm going to protect you. You'll be safe." During the night, I heard cars driving slowly by and flashing their lights into the jail. I prayed the nightmare would soon be over. Praise be to God, the Lord indeed was looking out for me, since I made it through the night without incident. A judge released me the next morning on a $100 bond, and my trial for disturbing the peace was set for September 22nd, 1961. While awaiting arraignment, several white people, townspeople, made it clear that I ought to beat it out of town. To reinforce the point, the house where I was staying was fired upon several times in a drive-by attack. Black residents, fearing for my life, and other voter registration workers had Mr. Curtis C. Bryant smuggle me out of Walthall County. The charges for me were still pending. I'm fairly close to my last few points, but I want to take an opportunity to read an excerpt from Raymond Arsenault's book called Freedom Riders. After Hardy was released on bond the next morning, Bob Moses phoned John Doerr to see if the Justice Department was willing to follow through with the promise to protect the rights of voter registration activists. Following his call to Doerr from the Magnolia jail in mid-August, Moses has sensed that the man who witnessed the attack on the Freedom Riders in Montgomery was a cut above the normal Justice Department bureaucrat. But he was still surprised when Doerr actually dispatched 2 staff attorneys to Mississippi to investigate Hardy's confrontation with John Wood. Even more surprising was the Justice Department's effort to block Hardy's prosecution in Mississippi. With Burke Marshall's approval, Doerr sought a temporary restraining order that would delay a scheduled September 22nd trial, citing a provision of the 1957 Civil Rights Act prohibiting intimidation of voters on racial grounds. Justice Department attorneys pleaded their case before District Judge Cox, but came away with nothing but a judicial scolding from the segregationist stalwart. Undaunted, Doerr immediately flew to Montgomery to make a personal appeal to Judge Richard Reeves, who agreed to convene a 3-judge Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals panel. When the panel met in Montgomery later in the month, Marshall himself argued the government case in U.S. versus Wood. And by the vote of 2-1, the court granted his request to overrule Cox, setting an important legal precedent for federal intervention in voting rights cases. Victory, right? Although Marshall was successful in his appeal to the Fifth Circuit, the good news only concerned me. Justice Department leaders had no intention of asserting such authority when issues other than voting rights were involved. Please note this headline: the stage for violence in Mississippi was already set, long before we ever arrived, but our presence seemed to add fuel to an already smoldering racist fire. This was truly the belly of the beast. Here are some things that were going on prior to and after my arrival and departure from Mississippi. Paul Pittman, then editor and publisher of the Tylertown Times, said in an editorial on August 10th that the legal action was not welcomed. Its conclusion could open the doors under federal control to a massive registration of Negro voters in a county where a preponderant weight of the Negro population is, by its lack of training and citizenship responsibility, eminently unqualified to exercise the franchise. Bob Moses went to Liberty. I told you that earlier. He was beaten by the sheriff's cousin. About 2 weeks later, Travis Britt from Baltimore, another voter registration worker, was attacked and beaten in the courthouse yard at Liberty. But the one that distressed me even more was that on September 25th, State Representative E.H. Hurst, a white farmer, shoots Mr. Herbert Lee, a black man. Mr. Hurst, who was armed with a pistol, struck Mr. Lee on the head with the pistol, crushing his skull. The Negro fell dead. A bullet was later removed from his head. "I must have pulled the trigger unconsciously," Mr. Hurst said. A coroner's jury, all white, ruled it a justifiable homicide. Curtis C. Bryant, vice president of the NAACP for southwestern Mississippi, said that there would be protection, but that has to be protection, not promised protection. He said, because once a man's life has been taken, he can't restore it. The federal government, through our Attorney General, will eventually cause bloodshed between the races, John Q. Wood said. That's inevitable. Eventually, we're going to have to register some Negroes. This headline refers, of course, back to the court case which we won. Burke Marshall, Department of Justice Chief of Civil Rights Division, in arguing the case, stated bluntly that Negroes who have lived their lives under white supremacy in Mississippi cannot be expected to try to register if, in addition to being threatened and beaten, they will be prosecuted in state court. Judge Reeves, who wrote the majority opinion, said that whenever any person interferes with the right of any other person's right to vote, he acts like a political termite to destroy a part of the foundation of our form of government. In 1963, Walthall County dropped all the charges against me. President Barack Obama's election did not signal the end of the struggle, but rather how much harder we have to fight to preserve the rights we have already attained. Remember, a war does not end when the treaty is signed, because that's when the work really begins. When I went to Mississippi in 1961, there were less than 200 black elected officials in the state, in the United States. As of 2010, that number had increased to over 10,000. Even Philadelphia, Mississippi, famous for the killing of the 3 civil rights workers in 1964, has a black mayor. According to the Conference of Black Mayors, as of March 3rd, 2008, there were 647 mayoral members registered with their organization. Now, although these numbers seem glowing, the reality is that there's a great deal of slippage. It appears that since we elected our first African-American president, the specter of overt racism has come out of the closet to take away the rights we've already won. I've never heard a president disrespected so much. You're a liar. You're a welfare president. We live in a country where freedom is the way, but freedom for the wrong reasons in the wrong hands is catastrophe. If we educate our people to the reality of the current socioeconomic and political changes that are occurring all around us, we just might find ourselves revisiting the themes of the 60s all over again. Before we allow this reversal, let's be about the business of saving America for the future of our children. All children, for we are our brother's keeper. Grown-ups have to have courage. This is a little boy whose picture was taken in a protest march about the right to vote. The fight for civil and human rights is an ongoing process. And lastly, but not least, African American history is American history. Thank you.